Hello and welcome to Focus 54, your real guide to African news. I'm your host, Prudence Mutimbanyoka. And in today's segment, we cast a spotlight on the U.S. brokered peace deal between Rwanda and the DRC, a deal that some call a breakthrough, while others are calling it a backroom trade pact. What do you call it? With both presidents absent and President Donald Trump of the United States of America at the center, questions arise. Is this about peace or is it about profit? And why are African institutions like the SADC, AU and ECOWAS not leading this process? I'll be joined later on the second segment by Rutendo Matinyarare, an African Pan-Africanist, a peace and justice advocate, as we unpack what this deal really means for Africa. We kickstart with South Africa, where thousands of residents in Cape Town's Nyanga informal settlement are enduring dire conditions after heavy rains and a cold front unleashed floods across the region over the weekend. Footage captured on Sunday shows residents wading through flooded pathways between waterlogged metal shacks, and aid organizations are seen distributing food and essential supplies to those affected. The group estimates that around 5,000 people in the community are in urgent need of support. The flooding follows days of strong winds and heavy downpours that have affected several parts of South Africa. We move on to DRC, where the Democratic Republic of Congo President Felix Tshisekedi praised the Trump administration over the U.S. brokered peace deal with Rwanda during an address in Kinshasa this Monday. He described the signing as a decisive turning point in putting an end to a conflict which for almost 3 decades has sown desolation in the east of his country, causing millions of deaths and displacing persons. The DRC and Rwanda signed a landmark U.S. brokered peace agreement in Washington, D.C. on June 27, ending years on conflict between the two neighboring countries. Well, this is our discussion story today. Stay with us as we will be unpacking issues around this peace deal in the second segment. In Senegal, President Bassirou Diomaye Faye called for an overhaul of international credit rating systems, saying they distort African economies and raise the cost of development financing. He said this during the 4th International Conference on Financing of Development in Seville on Monday. His comment follows a proposal by Spain, Canada, France, the UK and major multilateral lenders at the Financing Development Conference to introduce automatic debt suspension clauses to ease fiscal pressure on vulnerable nations during crises such as climate disasters, wars or pandemics. The 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, which was held in Seville from June 30 to July 3, aimed to reshape global aid and financial systems to better support sustainable development. In Uganda, the country has become Africa's top coffee exporter, overtaking Ethiopia with a record-breaking 47,000 tons shipped in May that racked about $243 million US. The East African country exported nearly 800,000 bags in May, up from 550,000 bags in the same time last year, representing a 43% year-on-year increase. Well, that's all we had in this segment. Join us in our second segment as we start to unpack the U.S. brokered deal between the DRC and Rwanda. I'm your host, Prudence Mutimbanyoka. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the second segment. I'm still your host, Prudence Mutimbanyoka, and we are now joined by Rutendo Matinyarare as we look into African agency versus foreign influence, examining who holds the power in peace building and what it takes for African sovereignty and leadership. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you so much.
Now tell us, the United States of America, through the President Donald Trump, has brokered a peace deal between DRC and Rwanda. Walk us through the specifics of the peace deal from your own analysis.
It's unfortunate that Donald Trump got involved because he's got an intention to get a Nobel Peace Prize as a peacemaker.
Okay.
But the truth of the matter is that the resolution of the Congolese conflict had started here in Africa.
Okay.
But that's point number one. Point number two, there are two separate conflicts that are being conflated over here.
Okay.
So I'll give you a bit of context. What happened is that the DRC has been having negotiations and ongoing negotiations with M23 ever since 2012, when M23 were defeated by the DRC, the UN, and SADC forces.
Okay.
There was an agreement that was made at that time between the M23 with the, they were not even called the M23, they were called CPD,
Okay.
with Kabila.
All right.
And they were supposed to be integrated into the Congolese army. There are people within the eastern part of Congo that are being marginalized, who are known as the Banyamulenge,
All right.
were supposed to be given an opportunity to have their leaders participate in the political space so that they can be elected and be representatives of their people within the eastern part of Congo. That wasn't honored. So that's why M23 was created as the March 2013 movement. With that, they then began to reconsolidate themselves after being defeated. And by the time that Tshisekedi came into power, they negotiated again with Tshisekedi to say, listen, Kabila did not honor some agreements that we had, integration of our people into the army, which is the CPD or M23 into the army, and for our participation in the political system. Why can't we do that? Since you are a member of the opposition, why don't you come hand in hand with us, since we're all opposition of Kabila, and see how it is that we can build a better country.
All right.
Then Tshisekedi agreed. So there was an integration of M23 into the Congolese army.
Okay.
When they were then dispatched into different parts of the country, because they were being taken away from the east to other parts of the country so that they are not within their stronghold,
Okay.
Tshisekedi started murdering, or at least the Congolese soldiers started murdering the M23 soldiers within these joint units.
Okay.
As a result, M23 had to pull out of these barracks and go back to the Sabinyo Mountains, which is at the border of Congo and Uganda. And they started rearming and training so that they can come back and reclaim the land that they had before 2012 agreement, so that they can then come back to the table to negotiate for what it is that they want to be included into the Congolese situation. So Donald Trump came in at a time where there was already peace processes, because once the M23 agreed and then they were killed and then they left, they came back and started fighting in 2023-24. When they were fighting, a peace process began in Kenya. That peace process then was said that Kenya is partial to Rwanda, and so we don't want Kenya involved. So then another peace process started in Rwanda or Angola.
So tell us, who initiated this peace
It
process?
was the Africans who initiated it, with the Kenyan negotiations, with the East Africa community, then the negotiations that started happening in Angola. The ones that happened in Angola actually led to a ceasefire in December 2024.
So how did Trump come to the picture?
So when there was a ceasefire negotiated in Angola, there was an agreement that the East Africa community will deploy a peacekeeping force. They deployed a peacekeeping force. There was peace. M23 stopped attacking, and Tshisekedi stopped attacking. They started talking. While they were talking, Tshisekedi decides that no, East Africa community is not helping me to destroy M23, so I'm calling SADC. So they called SADC to come in as an aggressive military wing that was being used to advance a war against M23 for the benefit of the Congolese.
Okay.
SADC went in, they began to fight M23, the ceasefire was broken.
All right.
Right? So when SADC gets in and starts fighting, I then go to Congo and tell the story that SADC did not come for peacekeeping here, yet their deployment was allowed by the SADC organ on the basis that they're going for peacekeeping.
Okay.
But they are here fighting instead of peacekeeping.
All right.
This information was relayed to the chairman of SADC and also to the East Africa community. And within this time, the East Africa community SADC had a meeting and agreed that there shouldn't be a war of aggression. Africans should be talking to each other.
All right.
And as such, SADC agreed that they were going to withdraw.
Okay.
Once they chose to withdraw, at this time SADC forces had been captured by M23, unfortunately.
So you are saying this is the initiative of the Africans?
It is the
It's not
initiative of
Donald
the
Trump.
Africans. And the problem that we have in the region is not the Africans not being able to talk to each other. It's a leader like Tshisekedi who is taking instructions from Belgium, taking instructions from America to continue to cause a war that can be negotiated.
Okay.
That is the first war. The second war is that Tshisekedi and the Congolese have been keeping terrorists who come from Uganda and terrorists who come from Rwanda, and they've been training and arming them so that they can fight Kenya-Rwandan speaking people. These are people who were separated into Congo from the previous Rwanda and Uganda kingdoms during the what you call it, the Berlin Conference. Those people are being persecuted by the Congolese government using these terrorist groups who caused the genocide in Rwanda. And so Rwanda is saying you cannot be training terrorists, people who caused the genocide that killed 1 million people in our country, to destabilize the eastern part of Congo and displace Kenya-Rwandan speaking people who have been there since the partitioning of Congo and Africa by the Berlin Conference. Then you intend to train the same people to also come and invade and remove Rwanda.
So with all that you're saying, is the US broker deal a reflection of Africa's diplomatic weakness, or is it a deliberate sidelining of African-led institutions like the AU, the SADC and ECOWAS? And if so, if these regional bodies have shown growing capacity to manage these types of crises elsewhere in the continent, why are they not leading the charge in resolving the DRC and Rwanda conflict?
Yeah, so with what happened is America barged into a process that had already begun. But they also barged in justifiably, because the Americans were invited by Tshisekedi. After SADC was defeated, SADC were captured, the Americans were persuaded by Tshisekedi that why don't you come in and fight M23 on our behalf, put your soldiers on the ground, give us equipment, and then you can have all the mineral resources of Congo as payment.
All right.
So already he had been given that offer, but then the reason why he couldn't take up the offer is by the time the Americans were given that offer, SADC had then agreed with the East Africa community that we will pull out and give dialogue and peace a chance. So by the time that Trump came in, there was already dialogue taking place. When I was in Congo, we had actually gotten contacted by security system of Zimbabwe, saying that they'd been contacted by the Congolese government to say, we have seen your guy talking to M23. There is no trust between us and M23, so we do not have communication channels. Are M23 ready to negotiate? Because we are ready to negotiate.
Okay.
I conveyed the message to Harare that yes, M23 were ready to negotiate and have been ready to negotiate.
All right.
So Harare was now looking to say, do we have talks here in Harare in a neutral territory, or do we continue the process in Angola? And the decision was made that let's continue the process in Angola.
Okay.
So by the time Trump comes in, there is already talks happening in Angola.
Okay.
Then, while Trump is reconsidering that I can't deploy, let me be part and parcel of the peace process, Qatar comes in they've got money. Then they say to the parties, come and talk here in Qatar and let's see how we can settle. All these people that are trying to broker an agreement that talks that had already started in Africa are interested in nothing else but influence and mineral resources from Congo.
Profits.
And profits. That's correct.
So some critics have speculated to say that rather than aiming to resolve the root causes of the conflict, the so-called peace deal primarily serves Western economic interests, like you are saying, by securing access to the DRC's critical minerals under the guise of diplomacy. So what's your view on this?
My view is the one thing that made these negotiations different to other negotiations is that for the first time, all sides of the story are coming onto the table beyond what it is that is media hype. Generally, the negotiations have been held on a premise that Rwanda is a Western proxy that is invading Congolese sovereignty. And as such, they want the minerals of Congo. They're destabilizing Congo so that Congo cannot function. Even I was a proponent of believing that very same argument until I went on the ground. And we realized that no, Rwanda has a real grievance as well, because they actually have a community known as Kinyarwanda or Banyamulenge who live in the eastern part of Congo. These are people separated from Rwanda or the kingdoms of Rwanda during colonialism and the start of the Berlin Conference.
Sorry, we'll start on that. Let us take a short breather. Also, he's saying African problems have African solutions. We take a short break and we'll catch up on that in the next segment. Welcome back to Focus 54 and thank you for staying tuned. In this third segment, the program on Africa's current affairs, and we are still discussing the U.S. brokered DRC peace deal with our guest Rutendo Matinyarare. Before the break, we were talking about externally brokered peace deal and Africa's place in this. Now, Rutendo, how can a peace deal brokered by Donald Trump be taken seriously?
I will say this. Because Tshisekedi had given Donald Trump the option to say, come in, bring your soldiers, and use your soldiers to fight against M23. The fact that Donald Trump decided that he's not going to put his soldiers on the ground, for me, is commendable. The least we need is American soldiers killing Africans in Africa.
All right.
So on that part, Donald Trump can be given credit. However, we also have to admit that he was left with no option but not to deploy, because the peace process, the negotiation process, and the ceasefire had already been initiated by the negotiations that took place in Angola and by SADC accepting to remove their soldiers from Congo. Because you need to understand this. The South African government had set aside 10 billion rand, which is about $600 million US for its deployment in Congo.
All right.
So by the time SADC was captured and South African soldiers were captured in Goma, the South Africans had enough finances to deploy more soldiers that would have protracted the war. But credit to President Ramaphosa is that with the negotiations that happened with SADC, with our chair being the head of that SADC, asking that why don't we pull out our soldiers? South Africa could have stubbornly said, we are going to deploy to get our soldiers out, but they didn't.
So do you think this will be long-lived? As looking at Donald Trump, he has played a polarizing role in escalating other global conflicts, such as the Israel-Gaza crisis, the Russia-Ukraine war, and rising tensions between Iran and Israel. And what does his involvement signal about the true intentions behind the DRC and Rwanda agreement?
We cannot depend on Trump. He's unreliable. He is a liar like most other Westerners allies. The issue is that the two African countries that are involved here, Rwanda and Congo, have to listen to each other's grievances. The Congolese must listen to the grievance of the Rwandans, who say you cannot be training genocideers and people who committed a genocide and people who are registered as terrorists by the United Nations and the United States. You train them in your country and then allow them to come into our country or to displace people into our country. You can't allow that. So the Congolese have got to hear that argument. The Rwandans have also got to understand the Congolese fears that, listen, you might cause the partitioning of our country into two or separate states. We don't want that. But fortunately, the M23 have said we don't want a separation of any part of Congo from Congo. We are Congolese people. We want one country, but what we want is inclusion. So inclusion into the army and inclusion into the political system.
Can any peace agreement bring lasting results without clear mechanisms of enforcement, timelines for disarmament, integration or armed groups, and without local community participation in the process?
No, it can't. And this is what the United Nations, which deployed all the way in 2002, should have been doing.
Okay.
They should have been integrating. They should have been enforcing certain agreements that were made at the Sun City Accord. Because Thabo Mbeki already facilitated an agreement that would have brought permanent peace, where the Kinyarwanda speaking people would stop being persecuted and involved and protected by the Congolese government.
Okay.
There was also going to be the stopping of training of FDLR and these terrorist groups that Rwanda doesn't like. There was also going to be a capture of their senior leaders who caused the genocide. They'll be sent back to Rwanda and taken through the courts.
Yes.
In fact, Kabila Joseph actually allowed at some point a joint deployment of Rwandan and Congolese soldiers in 2013, where this joint force went in and captured some of these rebel movements with an intention to destroy these rebel movements and to send back those that were part of the genocide into Rwanda so that they can what? They can be prosecuted.
All right.
And you have to understand that if there is a prosecution of these genocideers, then the threat that Rwanda is fearing does not exist.
Because
Rwanda
there will be peace and
reconciliation,
Yes.
and there will be a neutralization of this threat that Rwanda is afraid of. Because Rwanda is saying, if these people who caused the genocide come and they attack us and they remove our government, then we have a chance that another genocide will happen when these extremists come back into power.
Which means we do not even need a foreign hand in this.
Yes, and again, SADC must stop being used as a bulldog of Congo, because right now there were allegations that when SADC went, they didn't just fight M23. There was an intention, according to Munabisi Diakopo, the head, the major general of that force, that they were going to neutralize M23, and there was a second enemy. And apparently that second enemy was they intended to invade Rwanda. We cannot have SADC being associated with such allegations or working with these genocideers that caused the genocide in Rwanda.
So tell us, so why do you think the international peace deals consistently ignore the deeper historical drivers of the DRC conflict, like land disputes, unresolved citizenship questions, and ethnic tensions in favor of superficial power sharing of resources?
The international peacekeeping ignores that, because we Africans have been foolish enough to hold on to colonial borders. The colonial borders perpetuate tribalism. The colonial borders continue to perpetuate divisions and divide and conquer that was instilled by the colonizer. So for instance, here in Southern Africa, we keep educating our children about the Bantu migration. In Central Africa, they educate their children on the Bantu migration and what is called the Hematic theory. These theories tell our people that we are not all African. Some people are more African than others. The Bantu migration says that the Khoisan are more African than the Bantus that came from what? From North Africa. There's nothing like that. And this is colonial education that continues to divide Africans and confines us into these little borders that make others more African than others and deprives other people of mineral resources. So people are forced to fight their neighbors in order to get some resources that used to be theirs before the colonial borders.
But
so we are saying unless we remove these borders, we will always have these problems. And the peacekeepers internationally will always ignore these real problems so that we remain divided and they can continue to pillage our resources.
But we have seen so many African countries being empowered. Do you think there are other reasons that are causing this?
When you say other African powers being empowered, what do you mean, so that I get context?
Like we are saying, we have a voice. When we have been empowered, we have our organizations, AU, we have SADC, we have ECOWAS. We are empowered, we have our own voice. So what do you think is the reason why other countries are looking for the foreign hand?
Thank you. And I think you can reiterate that point again so that we make it clear to Africans that this particular conflict was resolved by a combination of coordination between the East Africa community and SADC, who agreed that SADC pull out. Because if SADC decided not to pull out, that war would still be happening. And Trump might even have deployed his soldiers to side with Congo and SADC, and there would be a protracted war. But fortunately, EAC and the SADC agreed that this is not going to be a fight between Africans. Let's stop. Let's give peace and dialogue a chance. So we need to use that a little more. We need to be more consistent with that. But the problem is certain African countries are beholden to Western powers. It's the same thing we see in West Africa, where West African countries have got Francophone, and the Francophone element continues to divide them. Hence Traore and the Sahel Alliance are at loggerheads with these other puppets of France who continue to kowtow to France's interests.
Okay, going back to our issue, what are the most urgent internal steps that the DRC and Rwanda must take, such as local reconciliation, land reform, demilitarization, and institutional reform to build a real sustainable peace beyond foreign-mediated agreements?
I think one of the very first things that the Great Lakes Alliance needs to start talking about is the bringing down of borders in that particular region. Because you've got a Rwanda that's got 26,000 square kilometers. Then you've got a Congo that is 35 times bigger than Rwanda, where it's holding onto all the mineral resources of the region, which includes the Tobaran belt that runs through Congo all the way into Rwanda with the greatest mineral reserves in the world. These nations need to share those mineral resources. And the only way that can be done is to go back to Pan-Africanism as given by Kwame Nkrumah, who said take down the borders so that each and every African country has an opportunity to share the wealth of Africa that is currently hogged by individual countries. Congo has also got to accept to itself that it doesn't have the capacity to defend that big territory. The territory has obviously proved too big, hence Congo needs to come and take SADC to go and fight its wars. If Congo cannot defend its borders from its neighbors or from fights with its neighbors because of little tribal conflicts that they have, we need to talk about uniting that region into one so that they share the resources and then they begin to defend their own borders with a common interest rather than fighting against each other like what is currently happening. Then the whole of Africa needs to look at removing these borders. And like I told you, the education system has got to change. There's still a very serious Belgian influence that continues to bring tribal divisions where the Tutsis are seen as strangers who come from the Middle East, which is a lie created by the Belgians. Just like we're seeing in South Africa, they're saying the Khoisan, the owners of the land of South Africa. It's all nonsense. We have to remove the Bantu migration and the Hematic theories from our education system, reorientate our people to understand that Africans are one and there is no better or bigger African than the other.
So we heard him. He said Africa has its own voices and it can solve its own problems. Just uniting and just knowing that we can have our own differences but agree agree to disagree. This is Focus 54. I'm your host, Prudence Mutimbanyuka, and we had Rutendo Matinyarare as our guest in this episode. Join us same time, same place next week. Stay blessed.